Okay, we'll get started. Welcome to another event at the Center for Global Asia at NYU Shanghai. My name is Tansen Sen. I'm the director of the center and a professor of history at NYU Shanghai. We have been running these monthly lectures, sometimes more than one lecture at a month, and we are winding down towards the end of the semester. And coming up in this month of April, we have a couple of other lectures, starting with Enseng Ho's talk this week, actually. So we have two lectures this week. On April 27th, we have another talk on Sinophone studies, and we wrap up the semester on May 4th with another talk as well. But today we have a exciting talk. Professor Lo Liang has agreed to give us a talk from Kentucky, where she is a professor at University of Kentucky. She has already published two books, two exciting books. Professor Lo studied at Beijing Normal University, doing her undergraduate and master's, and did her PhD at Harvard University. And then she has spent a lot of time abroad in Japan for about a year, right? And then also in Germany, the Netherlands, Singapore. And so she has been around the globe talking about a number of very interesting things. One first about her book that I usually use for my class on concept of China, the avant-garde and the popular in modern China, where she talks about the Chinese national anthem, which I usually use for my class. But her more recent book that came out this year is The Global Whitesnake. And I hope that she'll be in Shanghai to give us another talk on the global whitesnake. This is the famous story from Chinese literature. Today, she is going to talk about something that is connected to her first book, but going into more detail about the international and national in performance. The project is called Profound Propaganda, the International Avant-Garde and Modern China. And she is not only writing books and articles, she's also making documentary. So I'll welcome Professor Lo, but also ask her to start by telling us what this documentary that she is planning, and then get into her talk. For the audience, you'll see at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, Q&A box, and Professor Lo will be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll open up the floor for Q&A, and you can type in the questions. Some of the students have submitted their questions already, and you are welcome to submit your on Q&A. So welcome, Professor Lo. Thank you for joining us from all the way from Kentucky. And let's start by telling us about the documentary that you are making.
Thank you, Professor Sen, for your kind introduction and invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this series. I really want to be a student at your center and just to, listen to all the series. That would be heaven. That would be like the best possible option for me. Thank you all for coming. I'm really wanting to make a documentary, but it's still at the planning stage. It will be based on my new project, Profound Propaganda, and will feature Ivens, Joris Ivens, Paul Robeson, and Tian Han and their generation of international avant-garde and their relationship with China. So I'm writing this new book and planning 6 chapters. But based on this, I really want to make a documentary. And for now, I've been hoping to collaborate with Professor Zhang Tongdao at Beijing Normal University when I'm taking my sabbatical next year, and hopefully collaborate. He's done a 4-series TV documentary on Ivens, and he's planning a feature-length documentary as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. Let me first share something. I want to start with a documentary from 1958, made in China, narrated in Chinese, without much introduction. I'll just show the first 5 minutes of the opening, and then I'll start my presentation after that. Let me know if you can't hear.
我从呼伦贝尔草原的东北角开始了我在内蒙古自治区的旅行。1958年最初的日子，正在草原上奔驰前进。牧业生产合作社的蒙古族的牧民们，继承了他们祖先的豪迈的事业。 一批的烈马就这样被驯服了下来。这是最野的一批，现在他也不得不老实起来了。 牛群脚下的白雪引起人们的幻觉，那不是雪白的牛奶在草原上流动吗？牛奶每年都多得令人发愁。今年，呼和勒泰牧业生产合作社决定自己盖一座工厂，把牛奶加工成奶粉。 洁白的羊群，像大海中白色的浪花。这位姑娘有一个愿望，她要让中国6万万人都能穿上他们生产的羊毛。 姑娘的愿望，也是草原上每个牧民的愿望。现在，他们要让羊群平安地度过这个风雪的夜晚。气象站已经发出了警报，今晚将有风雪。 让我们把风雪关在蓝圈外边。预备好燃料，人们将温暖地度过冬天最后的时刻。新的牧民村像天空的星星一样散布在草原上。 今年，全自治区的牧民都要定居下来。第2天的早晨，牧业合作社的货车要到海拉尔去。海拉尔。 是呼伦贝尔草原的聚宝盆，四面八方的木材、皮革、牛羊和奶品都集中到这里加工外销。这座解放前只有2万多居民的草原城市，现在有7万多人。在这里。 每年有8个月时间可以见到冰雪。但是春天已经像贴在窗子上一张红润的面孔那样，离我们不远了。
So what you just saw is the opening of 早春, or early spring, made by the Dutch avant-garde documentary filmmaker Joris Ivens in Beijing in 1958. So this Chinese language documentary, made by a Dutch documentary filmmaker, produced by Zhongyang Xinyi, or the Chinese Central Newsreel and Documentary Film Company, in 1958, is an opening for my talk today, in which I want to trace back the international avant-garde and their relationship with modern China from 1958 back to 1938, when March of the Volunteers was used in another documentary made by Joris Ivens, The 400 Million, and when Paul Robeson entered into the course, published his keynote record in 1941, way before the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So this is the opening. I would like to suggest that we treat this 1958 Chinese language documentary made by a Dutch avant-garde filmmaker at the intersection of the avant-garde and socialist realism in 1958 in China. And it is an opening for our exploration of the power of a coalition building and allyship beyond national, racial, and geopolitical boundaries, both in the 1958 moment and today. So this is a publicity photo for the film. As you can see, the Chinese characters are in ink brush calligraphy style, and the dragon, the head of the dragon, is also in ink brush baimiao style, while the color and more expressively using film technique, accentuating the movement of the dragon, is sort of connected, the head and the tail. So this is a publicity photo for 早春, the film you just saw. And it really represents China, the dragon, as both old and new, both sort of dynamic and static, a hybrid of the traditional and the modern aesthetics and politics. So in the spring of 1958, the British film magazine, Sight and Sound, published a scathing review criticizing Dutch filmmaker Joris Ivens and his filmmaking between the late 1920s and late 1950s as, quote, easy propaganda, unworthy of his intelligence, end quote. Ivens made his name as a leading avant-garde documentary filmmaker of the European tradition with his short films, Bridge in 1928 and Rain in 1929, about Rotterdam and Amsterdam in the late 1920s. Some 30 years later, his La Scène en Contrepartie, The Sign Meets Paris, 1957, made in Paris, won Golden Palm in Cannes and San Francisco International Film Festival for Best Short Films. So the reviewer is basically saying he has all these artistic high points in the late 1920s and late 1950s, while the interval years was 30 years of easy propaganda. So when I interviewed Mr. Andrew Stufkens, the director of Ivens Archive in late 2009 in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, where the Ivens Archive is located, he basically mentioned this review a number of times in our conversation and said how Ivens had to really wrestle with this review throughout the second half of his life. Ivens would go on to defend himself in making 早春, this kind of poetic, lyrical documentary, in a letter likely written to Chinese film authorities in Beijing in English, handwritten letter preserved in the Ivens archive, claiming, quote, his films has a profound propaganda value in the West, end quote. So if we take that lens and look at the short film and the opening we just saw, 早春 was indeed about human activities and seasonal changes, as Ivens had always been focused on from Spanish Earth and many earlier and later films. You could see Ivens continued his practice in making his avant-gardist documentary Rain from 1929. I just keep that in the background. We waited for months in Amsterdam to catch the rain at different moments in the city's life cycle. Some 30 years later, rain changed into snow, but Ivens was still chasing all these seasonal changes. He waited for months to catch snow in Nanjing, for example, in order to shoot a group of children playing in the snow for his 早春, the film we just saw the opening of. In fact, 早春 was composed of three parts. The first part we saw is snow, opened from Inner Mongolia. The second part is early spring, and the third is before Spring Festival. So when 早春 was completed, neither the audience nor the censors had expected a propaganda film about the Great Leap Forward to be a lyrical, poetic film centering on seasonal changes, joys of expecting New Year's presents, children playing in the snow and having fun, and children's red faces looking through red paper cuts, decorating windows frames as the last frame of the opening we just saw had shown us. So I want to use three quotes to frame today's discussion. And the timing would be going backwards from 1958. So this quote that you can see in Chinese and translated into English is from Tian Han from 1958. He says, quote, 我们一定要做到既宣传又艺术，因有艺术更能宣传. So this is sort of echoing what Ivens is doing in his letter defending his artistic, poetic, lyrical propaganda film at the same time. But if you trace back to the first quote, it's quite sort of counterintuitive to call Hollywood the center of words agitation and propaganda, while independent film groups are already engaging in courageous pioneering work. So this is in fact Ivens when he was first arriving in Hollywood in 1936. He was observing how the Hollywood left or progressive intellectuals in Hollywood had come together doing avant-gardist pioneering work at the time. And it won't be a surprise if you know what will happen, with the making of the national anthem and the story of agitation and propaganda at the time. The second quote is from, in fact, Paul Robeson on our title today. And he's talking in the context of the Spanish Civil War. And he says, quote, the artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or for slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative, end quote. So the keywords of freedom and slavery is very central to Robeson's identity, but also to his concern about how artists must take sides. Together with Hemingway and other progressive artists, he was basically saying, as artists, we can't there's no choice to keep us away from politics in the context of the 1937 moment. So this is the time frame, and I want you to keep thinking about what Tian Han said about artistry and propaganda all the way back from the 1958 moment to the late 1930s moment. So what does Ivens mean by a profound propaganda value? In order to better understand the circumstances surrounding Ivens's claiming profound propaganda value for his ongoing film project in China in 1958, we need to trace kind of a quick tour following his filmmaking from East Berlin to Paris to Beijing from around 1954 to 1958, where Paul Robeson is going to play a central role in collaborating across, in a transatlantic fashion across the Cold War curtain. So these three films made from 1954 to 1958 is very important for our understanding of the 1958 China film that we just saw the opening of. And they involve a group of interwar international avant-gardes active in the post-World War II moment throughout the 1950s decade in East Berlin, in Paris, in Beijing. So I'm going to go directly to the first film that's on this slide. This is a film made in East Berlin, post-produced in East Berlin, with each episode actually made on location in each country involved. It is commissioned by the World Federation of Trade Unions. So it is very much a propaganda film created to promote international workers' movement at the post-World War II moment in East Berlin. Importantly, the 6 rivers chosen to represent international workers' movement originated from countries and continents across the Cold War curtain, Iron Curtain. The people involved were representatives of what I call the interwar international avant-garde, just to name a few: Vladimir Posner, Bertolt Brecht, Dmitry Shostakovich, Pablo Picasso, and Paul Robeson. So in addition to participating in the film production, Picasso also painted a cover for a book that's a tie-in with the documentary celebrating the 10th anniversary of the World Federation of Trade Unions. Paul Robeson is really a unique example in this group of participants. The African-American Shakespearean actor, concert musician, athlete, civil rights activist. At that time, he is based in Harlem, where he grew up during the Harlem Renaissance in the post-World War I moment. So how was he able to participate in the sort of transatlantic project? So his participation in singing the English version of the film's theme song, in particular, was famously narrated in vivid details in his sort of artistic autobiography, Here I Stand, published in 1958, the same year when Ivens was in Beijing, and instantly translated into Chinese as 我就站在这儿, Here I Stand, and published in Beijing in the same year. So if you look at how Paul Robeson was introducing the film in his autobiography, it is about his contributing the song to the film. The letter came without much context, and he wasn't aware of who was involved in the project. The lyrics were in German, but the song was to be sung in English. The various verses and choruses were to be sung in the precise number of seconds specified for each, and I was to sing unaccompanied. It was a song for peace and freedom, a song of brotherhood. And then he sort of came to hear this song when he was visiting Canada and was able to see a screening of the film Song of the Rivers. Quote, "Masters of culture, champions of peace, what a wonderful filmmaking company I had become associated with." And there was a warm glow of appreciation for the invitation they had sent me, making it possible for a Negro American to join with Hollander and Russian and German and Frenchman and all the others in creative work for peace and liberation. So this is his circumstances when he had to record with planes flying by his brother's second floor apartment in Harlem, and secretly mail the tape across the ocean to Ivens in East Berlin in order to participate in this project. The second film on my list was another German language propaganda film, Der Windhorse, or The Wind Rose. It is commissioned by the World Federation of Women. The two central themes of class struggle and gender equality, very important for the interwar international avant-garde, were still very central to the concerns of artists and activists during the global 1950s. More importantly, a diverse representation of race and ethnicity was emphasized. So it was again across the Cold War Iron Curtain. The story of female village leader in China could be seen side by side with stories of female cadre, teacher, worker, peasants in the Brazilian, the Soviet, the Italian, and the French episodes of this kind of epic length, multi-country, multi-site, on location shoot, and then post-produced in East Berlin. So very similar to the 1954 international workers movement documentary. So this is like international women's movement in the post-World War II moment. Ivens was again the mastermind, but the designated lead director was the Brazilian Alberto Cavalcanti, who is again an avant-garde filmmaker of Ivens' generation, active already from the late 1920s, in particular in the city symphony film genre that Ivens was also part of, but Berlin, the symphony of a city is representative from the late 1920s. As a whole, these 5 case studies, including the French one, was translated as 5 songs or 五支歌, and introduced to China with Ivens when he moved from Paris to Beijing in 1958 to make 早春, the film we just saw. The 5 cases, again, across the Cold War Iron Curtain, but also with 5 beautiful women at the center of the 5 stories representing 5 countries. So the last thing from France was the most intriguing. It was made by the female director, Yannick Belnan, who was a very young director at the time and continued to make strong films with strong feminist positions in her later careers. All these 5 films are performed by 5 actresses. So this is a very interesting moment to talk about experimentation and documentary versus feature, which will be raised very soon by students of Ivens in Beijing. So what about the French language award-winning film from Paris? Archive drawings in the Ivens archive help us locate a much more socially engaged take or outlook in this Paris film than the reviewers emphasizing its artistry didn't really recognize or didn't want to acknowledge. So it is very important to think about the propaganda value of artist films and the artistry of propaganda films in this context. So when Ivens went to China from Paris in early 1958, he brought two 1957 films he made with him. One is 5 songs, the other is the Paris film. So on March 7th, 1958, in celebration of the International Women's Day, at the screening of Dear Windhorse, now translated into Chinese as 五支歌 or 5 songs, Ivens gave a speech congratulating Chinese Women's Federation, which was a branch organization of the International Women's Federation that commissioned this film. In the Chinese episode of the film, you see a local village election chose a female village lead, and her husband became her supporter and second in command, both in the family and in the village. So all these 5 women on the cover of the 小人书 or picture book are performed by actresses, professional actresses, although the story might be sort of documentary and close to reality. A few months later, when Ivens gave a short training course at the newly reopened Beijing Film Academy in August 1958, he was very much using his own experience making documentary film as case studies for teaching. Ivens' teaching materials were translated into Chinese for the benefit of his students. A particular Chinese handout with a title that could be rendered as, quote, the creative methods of my documentary filmmaking and the development of documentary film in the past 30 years, end quote, was preserved in the Ivens archives. So in his teaching, Ivens connected the development of documentary filmmaking with his own career from the late 1920s to the late 1950s. This conceptual framing was very similar to the reviewer who criticized him for making 30 years of, quote, easy propaganda, end quote. However, Ivens was making his own argument about the connections between the late 1920s and the late 1950s. He insisted on making poetic, lyrical, socially engaged films, regardless of whether the reviewers think they were art films or propaganda films. Maybe they're both. After watching Die Windhorse, 五支歌, and other films Ivens showed to them during his course, the Chinese students asked him a number of important questions from the Beijing Film Academy short training course in 1958. These questions from students in Beijing in 1958, preserved in the archives, deserve our close attention because they touched upon some of the key issues central to filmmaking and artistic production then and today, both in China and globally. So the first cluster of questions already opened a can of worms. What is the avant-garde movement? That's the first question. And the end of the first question is the most important to me. Quote, was there any contradiction existing between the avant-garde and socialist realism, end quote. From the way the question was asked, was there any contradiction? We could infer that both the students and Ivens, in the context of his class in Beijing in 1958, did not assume a huge gap dividing the avant-garde and socialist realism as we often assume. Here in Ivens' classroom, socialist realism was not considered oppositional to the avant-garde, to say the least. On the contrary, it might even have been considered by them at that time in Beijing as an energetic reinvention or a powerful continuation of the interwar international avant-garde in the 1958 Chinese context. So if you look at the last question, it proves that Ivens had shown 5 songs to the students because they were asking, quote, was 5 songs a documentary film or a feature film, an artistic documentary film or a documentary fiction film, end quote. These questions were closely related to question number 3, quote, what is the difference between the avant-garde and new realism, end quote. So these questions, we may imagine them emerging from the so-called mid-1980s Chinese avant-gardist moment, which is often considered the emergence of the Chinese avant-garde in the post-Mao moment as a reaction against socialist realism, or in the context of the so-called 6th generation of Chinese documentary of Chinese filmmakers, Wang Xiaoshuai and Jia Zhangke, who experimented at the border of feature and documentary and artistic documentary or documentary fiction. But here we saw these questions asked in 1958. Was this questioning itself not a manifestation of the transformation of the avant-garde in the 1958 moment? Was it also a manifestation of socialist realism as it strives to make sense of the legacies of the interwar and post-war international avant-garde in the Chinese context? In the same letter, Ivens wrote in English in Beijing, defending his choice of making poetic lyrical documentary during the Great Leap Forward in China. He specifically talked about, I quote, I proposed to the studio intentionally this poetic lyrical style of the films in order not to suffer the effects of being outdated later, end quote. In effect, he was declaring that he did not want to make, quote, easy propaganda, that his intention was to make an enduring film about China and how Chinese people live their lives for the Western audience. He clearly saw the propaganda value of his films, especially how it could influence perceptions of China in the West. However, he was not making propaganda film without high artistry. That is Tian Han's speech in 1958, very much echoing that sentiment. So following this kind of declaration of making poetic lyrical propaganda, he wrote the following and then crossed it out, likely because he was self-censoring and was afraid being accused of going against realism. I quote, I think that a documentary made in the poetic style as I did can and should not be judged only from the standpoint of actuality. What was he trying to say here? Defending his using of actresses to perform the female leaders in their Windhorse, or waiting for months to catch a snowfall by and arranging the kids to play in the snow in order to capture the best moments of childlike joy or happiness in Zaochun. Ivens used actuality rather than reality in this particular self-defense, which could also open a range of interpretive possibilities about what is representing the real, what is realism. In the same letter, he also added another paragraph after crossing out the above one, where he says, consider these films not at all as up-to-date reportage of the situation of the villages in China. They inspire the audience in another way. So indeed, in Zaochun, instead of only focusing on the workers, peasants, and soldiers and their revolutionary actions, Ivens chose to spend a lot of screen time on seasonal changes, everyday activities, to try to inspire the audience in another way. Here, the intended reader for Ivens's handwritten letter in English was likely Chinese film authorities. He needed to defend himself and speak to the audience. Paul Robeson emerged as an important figure again at the concluding point of his long letter of self-defense. I quote, "My whole life and work is linked to a fight for socialism, and that will stay that way. There will never be any doubt among the progressive audiences about that. In that respect, my position among them could be compared with that of Paul Robeson," end quote. So Robeson's central role in building transatlantic allyship in the making of the 1954 Das Lied der Ströme, or the Song of Rivers, should be emphasized again here in the context of his history of Trans-Pacific coalition building allyship with Tian Han and Ivens, as detailed in my study on the powerful roles this generation of international avant-garde played in the making of the Chinese national anthem. So much of the volunteers, or Qilai, as in Robeson's record and in our poster, was taught to Robeson by the Shanghai YMCA secretary Liu Liangmo in New York in 1939. But the same YMCA secretary who taught Robeson how to sing Qilai had returned to China in 1949. And he made possible the immediate translation and publication of the Robeson's autobiography, Here I Stand, as I mentioned before, and I quoted to talk about the 1954 film collaboration. Robeson's book, widely influential in China, while Ivens was on location there, spoke to the power of music. Here in this little hemmed-in word, where home must be theater and concert hall and social center, there was a warmth of song of love and longing, songs of trials and triumphs, deep flowing rivers and rollicking brooks, hymn song and ragtime ballad, gospels and blues, and the healing comfort to be found in the illuminable sorrow of the spirituals. So as the song of a runaway slave, the spirituals have been extremely central to Robeson's coming of age during Harlem Renaissance, but also his concert artist career, which led him to London, and the discovery of the wider international word that's central to his identity. Robeson's autobiography also talked about the working class alliance based on his identity and his coming of age, and his discovery of Africa and Asia at SOAS. And he's maybe their most famous alumni, according to Professor Michel Hawkes, and a dorm was named after him at SOAS in the University of London. So with the discovery of the common people, the African American and Chinese, Asian, the continents of Africa, the common people of all nations are truly brothers in the great family of mankind. And that is his foundation to continue talking about, quote, the remarkable kinship between African and Chinese culture, in particular, in terms of the pentatonic music scale, and how he was able to discover folk, sort of a kind of folk internationalism in his pursuit of music and activism. Similarly, this sort of discovery from the late 20s and 30s was written into Ivens's autobiography, Camera and I. He wrote in details about how music and narration shaped the documentary, The 400 Million, shot on location in China in 1938, 20 years prior to his making of Zao Chun in China in 1958. So this documentary, made on location in China in 1938, featured very interesting narration, as Ivens was talking in his documentary, by Dudley Nichols. Just going to show you a 1-minute sequence.
Always millions of quiet men turning the earth over and over. Wheat in the northwest, rice in the rich waters of the south. The two rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, long generations of hard work. The earth, the wind, and the water. The enormous, the living China. Yellow storm, dust carried by northern winds. The Great Wall sinks down under the dust. China sinks down. She is robbed by Japan and by the Western powers without
So this
resistance.
is the kind of documentary Ivens wanted to make already in 1938 on location in China. So he's talking about river, earth, wind, water, the living China, the dynamic China. And that sets up the drama of the yellow storms and the invasion of Japan. So that is the kind of sort of art and propaganda really seamlessly intertwined in this 1-minute sequence from the 1938 film, where March of the Volunteers was used 3 times in the same film. So already in the 400 Million film, we just saw a 1-minute sequence from, Ivens was thinking about poetry and propaganda, humanity and revolution, human portraits in propaganda in particular, as we saw the opening of the girl in the Mongolian grassland, the children smiling in front of the paper cuts. So when Ivens was talking about in the autobiography, his filmmaking of the 400 Million on location, you can see his zooming in this old man sitting on the ground. Quote, "A man sitting on the ground in the middle of China becomes a symbol bearing the slogans of the reality of freedom, sorrow, and the will to live," end quote. And then you have the still in that film of that old man, where you sort of participate in his cinematic narration of feeling sorrow and feeling the reality and the will to live. Where the same autobiography also mentioned how Qilai, here spelled as CHILAI, the same song that Robeson sang a few years later, together participating into this chorus of Dutch songs, sailor songs, love songs, songs of the Hungarian plain. And then we all sing a Chinese war song we have learned, 起来. So if you look at the archival image from the Ivens archive, this song written by Tian Han and composed by Nier, written out for him in Chinese, was numbered number 1 and titled Volunteer March in English. So Ivens has collected more than a dozen Chinese songs for the post-production of his documentary in Hollywood in early 1939, with the support of Hemingway and other progressive intellectuals. But this one is particularly important for him from his point of view and was titled number 1. We may have all heard the original clip from the 1935 film that Tian Han largely wrote the story and the lyrics for the song. Even just the opening lines would be really important to keep in mind. But here I want to show you the 1-minute sequence of flag raising in the 400 million documentary, where this is a central use of the song in the documentary. There are another 2 moments that's also very important.
Enough. Their warships are on our rivers. They rob our factories, our crops. They kill everyone. Will there never be an end?
Yes, it is true. We must endure the years of a hard war. That's why we must forget our old differences. Why should we fight one another? We must defend ourselves against aggression. We must unite. Then we can win.
The flag of the Chinese Republic. One-fifth of mankind under one flag. Actors leave their theaters and play on the street corners. They instruct the audience how to resist the enemy.
So this is a full sequence when the song was used to stitch together a number of important scenes, including street theater, edgy pop style propaganda, theater on the street, and female leaders making speech to promote donation for the war effort. Here is where Robeson came into play, and the title image in our poster. So Robeson was very active already in the late 1930s. He was in support of the Chinese fight against Japan in London, in rallies with Madam Chiang Kai-shek and many other groups already. But when he returned to New York and met Liu Liangmo, he was able to learn a number of Chinese songs from him. He's studied Swahili and Chinese and other languages in Seoul. And at the time, excuse me, they were able to actually do concerts before the release of this 1941 keynote record, which collected not just 起来, but also 凤阳, as in 凤阳花鼓, and many other songs, worker song, sailor song, soldier song, as well as many folk tunes with the Chinese chorus, collaboration between Liu Liangmo and the Chinese chorus. The audio quality is extremely poor, but I'd like maybe to play just 30 seconds.
One heart with the torch of freedom.
This is the English part.
With the torch of freedom. March on, march on, march on and on. 起来，不要做奴隶的人们，把我们的血肉筑成我们新的长城。
That was the opening line. So the same Robeson was in Prague in April 1949, just a few months before the founding of the PRC. And he sang 起来 again in Chinese with the audience, with people like Guo Moruo, Tian Han, and other Chinese delegates sitting in the audience. So a few months later, they would return to China and debate on which song should represent the new PRC.
起来，不愿做奴隶的人们，把我们的血肉筑成我们新的长城。中华民族到了最危险的时候，每个人被派就发出最好的呼声。起来，起来，起来！我们完成一心，冒着敌人的炮火前进，冒着敌人的炮火前进，前进，前进，前进。
So facing Chinese authorities and defending himself, Joris Ivens was in fact using Paul Robeson's politics and aesthetics to justify his own politics and aesthetics. He was in effect saying that by making better propaganda, profound propaganda, in regard to the accusation, easy propaganda, rather than those easy propaganda you are accusing me of, I could represent China better to the West. Evans himself, like Robeson, as we have traced in this brief hour, had a long history of engaging with China across continents and bridging historical and political divides. By further connecting Evans from the standpoint of 1958 with Paul Robeson, I hope we can better articulate unexpected relationships and make visible the power of allyship and dissenting from different views of what politics, what propaganda, and what artistry should be, so as to make visible the connection between the international avant-garde and modern China at not just the interwar period, but also the post-war moment. Thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to questions. I'll stop share.
Thank you, Loliang. That was really wonderful. And I would request the audience, especially because you are all either my students or affiliated with NYU Shanghai, if you want to come onto the screen to raise your hands or write your questions down in the Q&A box. So one thing I wanted to start with is, what did the Chinese think about the involvement of two foreigners in making this song the national anthem? What has there been a discourse within the Chinese Communist Party? You said Tian Han was there, Komoro was there when they heard it before 1949 establishment of the PRC. So what kind of discourse was taking place about a filmmaker and a Black singer of the Chinese national anthem? Was it all positive? Because originally, you write in your chapter, this was a movie song that became the national anthem. So and the involvement of two foreigners two foreigners who were involved in the pre-PRC era of China, right? I mean, the national, the song being sang when the Republic of China flag being hoisted. So was there a criticism about not making it the national anthem and the involvement of foreigners as some kind of a red flag?
That's a really, really insightful question, which assumes that the power of the international participants are somewhat articulated, at least in order for them to be criticized. But I don't think that's the case, meaning like people are really not giving them much credit in terms of Paul Robeson and Ivens' participation in the making of the popular film song into the national anthem. I think that, you know, India's Chinese radio stations has been keep using Robeson's version, the Chinese version from the 1940s. So there's many such evidence of the international reach of the song before it became the national anthem, the precise reason for it to be the national anthem. But that sort of the power of those international participants have not been fully recognized. So they are not criticized because they are not taken seriously, I think, in a way. And that is the irony of these people. They were considered decorative, like good friends of the Chinese people, but not essential, maybe. So in a way, I want to excavate their contribution in a way, but there are many criticisms, of course, in the Western world about their, you know, communist or communist sympathizer. You know, Robeson's passport was taken away for close to a decade under McCarthyism. And Ivens has been, you know, when I talk to my Dutch colleagues that I'm interested in Ivens, they say, oh, why Ivens? He's a communist filmmaker and that's it. So yeah, so it's very interesting, I think, to see how they are really liked but not taken seriously in China, but also sort of not taken seriously in the West as well.
A related question is, how much do the Chinese actually know about them today? I mean, it doesn't seem to be in discourse at all, right?
Yeah, not much. I think I should keep giving this lecture.
And I should assign your articles every semester, right? So what?
Not many people. I would assume not many people. Yeah, they may have watched increasingly the Robeson video singing in Prague. Yeah.
So one of the questions here is about the translation of the song. You showed the Chinese version that Ivens had. So can you tell us how it went to Paul Robeson? So how did it become a song that he would sing? So what was the history of that song from Ivens getting it and then translated and then Paul Robeson singing it?
There might not be intermediate role that Ivens played in terms of Robeson. I think Robeson got it from the Liu Liangmo connection, the Shanghai YMCA secretary who was on exile because of his anti-Japanese activities. He was persecuted by the nationalists and was running away from Shanghai to New York. And he's one of those people who did like thousands of people public singing outdoors, March of the Volunteers, precisely as portrayed in Ivens' documentary. You see this conductor and this wall of people standing around him in the 1 minute sequence that I shown. So Liu Liangmo is the connection. There were, when I interviewed Tianhan's son for my first book, he claimed that I don't know how reliable his memory is, that Liu Liangmo and Robeson has kept sending royalties back to Tianhan's descendants because of this direct connection via Liu Liangmo. Liu Liangmo is also part of the Soviet music group that Tianhan and all these Renguang An'e, all these people are active in the mid-1930s in Shanghai. So Liu Liangmo, as a direct connection between Tian Han and Paul Robeson, is more reliable, I think. There's no Ivens in this sort of connection. But Ivens got the song, according to the archival record, from his meeting, he met Tian Han. I didn't put that picture, it was in my first book. He met Tian Han in April 1938 in Wuhan when he was shooting the Taiyuan, victory. After he returned from Taiyuan, he met Tian Han in April 1938. And I have discovered a series of priceless archive photos showing them. And Robert Capa, the Hungarian photojournalist from Spain, directly returned from Spanish Civil War and moved from Spain to China. So this whole group of people, Tian Han was welcoming them as the leader of the cultural group at the time. And I assume he had, known about the song, if not directly from this meeting, from collecting the popular songs for his post-production and having it written out in Chinese for him, as shown in the archive record. But in terms of translation, the first English translation is by Li Baochen, who is choral movement leader in Chongqing, in the wartime capital. He's bilingual. He published his translation in New York Times on New Year's Eve, titled Songs from China, similarly to Songs from New China with Paul Robeson, but that's in 1938. So I think 1 year later, Paul Robeson, with the collaboration of Liu Liangmo, some even say Tian Han himself also, through Liu Liangmo, translated the version. That's why all these torch of freedom, democracy, and world peace, and those are really creative translations for the Liu Liangmo Paul Robeson version. That's made in 1939. Yeah.
So one of the questions from the student, since they read your chapter, they're asking about this thing that you mentioned, quoting you actually, the monolithic entity of nationalism enriches our understanding of the international dimensions of Chinese cultural production during the post-World War I period. So the student is asking, is there other events or moments where you can see a similar kind of international national connection in the history of China, especially related to artistic production, movies, or perhaps music. I think 50s is one. I think there are lots of similar kinds of songs and music being composed, national and international, right?
Yes, I think the two East Berlin films are good examples for this kind of newly founded international organization in the post-World War II moment, the World Federation of Women, the World Federation of Trade Unions. And those are really important because each of the episodes are shot on location representing the nation, right? As part of the international chorus or the international flow of rivers, 5 songs and the Song of Rivers. And that itself, I think it's very symptomatic of the 50s moment, as you suggest, and of course the Bandung Conference. And then post that in 1958, you have the coming together of a new sense of internationalism that's very consistent with what Ivens and Robeson were pursuing in the late 30s with the Spanish Civil War, the anti-fascist Popular Front. And that, I think, translated into something very utopianist and in the post-World War II moment in the 50s. So they have all this aspirational moment, and that's, I think, still important. You can say naive and, like the political realities, the harsh political movement starting from 1958 in China and Cultural Revolution justified a lot of sort of neglect of these pre-1958, enthusiasm, utopianism, and aspiration. But I do think they have a place also in the historical narrative of China, and its experimental quality is very important to closely examine, so as not to just throw them into the dustbin of history because they are propaganda.
Now, one question here you can see on the Q&A box. Evans, is his work still accepted in China today? And especially the depiction of poverty and misery, that, I mean, this is something that can be used for propaganda purposes because it's about the Japanese war. But how, I mean, other than the fact that very few people actually know about his contribution towards the making or propagation of the national anthem, how is this 400 million seen in China today? Is it shown in China? And the other question was about you making a documentary in China. It's not easy to get a permission to do those kinds of things. So how would you yourself do the documentary that you want to do in China?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think one example for Evans' reception, likely more in the Anglophone world, I think. The documentary China in Revolution that we often use for teaching, the 3-part documentary, has footages from the 400 million. Especially if you remember the slim man in his long gown talking about, we need to like propagate. And that is from the 400 million. So he's there in the standard sort of textbook documentary for teaching modern China in the Anglophone world, for sure. His reception in China, I think it's under the umbrella of what I described as good friends of the Chinese people. He was personally invited by Premier Zhou Enlai, who was of his same age, who went through the same kind of avant-gardist experimental, who performed female roles in school drama troops. And so this generation, I think there's a lot to be said. However, Evans and his generation are often considered, studying Evans is rather politically correct in China today. And that's a good thing for me. But it doesn't mean I'm not critically examining the intricacies of political collaboration and artistic sponsorship and all the other problems coming with it. I think I really need to be more discerning than that. But Zhang Tongdao, Professor Zhang Tongdao at Beijing Normal, may be the leading figure in studying and making documentary himself, but himself a documentary filmmaker. So I'm not sure what does it suggest, but if I can get his sponsorship, that might be useful in terms of access, because he has all the Chinese language and other collections on Evans, and that may open doors, but also has the danger of self-censorship and censorship, right? In terms of, so it's very hard to talk about what's in the system or outside the system, because in China it's very, it's not that obvious, right? As you really know very well, I think, based in Shanghai. So I think these are good questions, but Evans is really not considered. His connection with Zhou Enlai also sort of sheltered him a lot in terms of
connected to that is you have shown his collection, his archives. What about the Chinese archives? So what you said that maybe a professor has this archives, but have you looked at the archives, especially the question that was asked to him, what is this avant-garde? What was the response, and what discourse did it take place within the Chinese dance drama performance group of people, the intellectuals? Did he actually answer that question? You showed the questions that were asked. So what kind of discourse happened in the 50s? And what is the discourse perhaps happening now on the avant-garde in China?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. One is the lack of or the incompleteness of archival research, right? You only have one piece of the puzzle. You don't have, I can't find the answer sheet, for example, in the archive, in the same dossier, right? I only find questions, but not answers. And that's extremely unsettling. And in terms of Chinese archives, I haven't done any, and that's not just because of the pandemic, but because I just finished my second book. So this is the traces of the incompleteness of the research, and it's really at a very early stage. Although I've been going to the Ivens archive starting from 2009 and 4 times in the past 4 decade, I haven't done much archive on Paul Robeson. I haven't done much archive on the Chinese side of the story. So I couldn't really answer these questions, and I just can't wait to go back to when the travel is possible again, and when I can get an affiliation and really dig into the archives. I think there are really important documents that's going to provide more complexity, irony, ambiguity, and and I'm expected to be confronted with all these things that's going to maybe ask me to rewrite what I've written, and that's really important, I think.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think it will be nice to see what happens during the Cultural Revolution with the song being changed, right? I mean, and what the reaction would be from the people who had been supporting the communist movement and the song. But there's a question, and this is also pertains to something a broader issue that takes place, and then you can see it on the Q&A. This is by Professor Dwayne Corpus. There was a breakup between the Soviet Union and China shortly after the 58 moment, right? And where did Paul Robeson fit into that? Because he was both pro-Soviet Union and China until this time. Did he say anything? Did he choose a path? Because I know, for example, in India, the Communist Party got divided between pro-Soviet Union and pro-China. Do we see that kind of decision being taken by Paul Robeson with the Soviet-China breakup? And the second part is about what does this type of national level and international level historical context have an impact on the cultural history? You were mentioning modern China, the cultural history of modern China that you want to say.
That's a great question, and I don't think I have an answer right now. When I look at Paul Robeson, and he's sort of in the 60s, I think, when the, oops, it was gone, the question. So I was just trying to reread it. It is a very important question. It's something I need to look into. I don't think I have an answer right now, but I think it's an extremely important question, the China and Soviet split. And that was also into closer to the moment of Cultural Revolution compared to the moment I'm talking about today. So I really need to look further. I kind of only looked at this 1958 moment for now in my research and archival work with Ivens. But the story of the 1960s and 70s are so central. Although in my funding proposal, I say I'm going to write from 1918 to 1958, that's not the truth. I really want to, because they really want to have a manageable sort of time period in terms of, but I really would look into for now I'm only having the energy or time to look at the first decade, basically, in the PRC. So I will certainly look further into the Soviet, Sino-Soviet split and Cultural Revolution. Ivens produced his 12-hour epic, 愚公移山, how the foolish old man moved mountains. Yeah, so these are all very important to me, but I need to really do my research and be able to answer better.
But 60s is also important because Tehan is then arrested, right, during the Cultural Revolution, and then that results in a different direction in which the national anthem then moves, and Tung Fang Hung becomes the song of the time. So I wonder how I don't know if you have worked on the 60s with regard to the music and performance and propaganda in China. I wanted you to, if you have compared the 50s, which is a very different period, it seems, where experiment with the foreign is taking place in different levels culturally, right? And the 60s, it's a basically an inward-looking way, but still there's a music performance and art production taking place. And so what happens to the international after the 58 moment? Do you see a big change? And when does that international moment come back? Is it after 78, or do we wait until the 90s that you have the Japanese and the Korean and then eventually the K-pop coming back? So how do you see this national, international dynamics in China during the larger, a period of modern contemporary China?
That's a great question. And I think new research has been quite exciting from I can tell about, for example, Zhang Qin, mainly, with Stanford dissertation is very exciting. I just read it. And it takes Zhang Qin as connecting point and continuing internationalizing in an avant-gardist fashion, according to her. And I think it's quite convincing how the revolutionary model opera is a really good example of that kind of experimentation. And I think, whose book I just reviewed? Oh, actually, Emily's book is interesting too in this context because of her discussion about how ballet, right? So what we consider the leading genre was really only a played a minor role compared to Chinese dance in the sense qualified classic and folk dance. So in that sense, I think these are all exciting ways of looking at how artistic experimentation are ongoing throughout 60s and 70s. And they are international in the sense of not just genre and, instrument used and other, ballet in terms of form, but also in terms of a continued internationalism or global socialism and how that can condition a new kind of coming together in spite of the Cold War condition. That's what I'm really interested in too. But I think there are much more critical room for critical analysis in that vein as well, as I try to do for the 1950s, at least for now. Yeah.
Great. I hope to see more of your research on this topic as you extend it beyond the 58 moment, and hope to see you in Shanghai and listen to you on the great global snake story, which is fascinating as well. But I would like to thank you for this wonderful talk and spending some time with us and our students as well. And come to Shanghai and do some archival work, and we'll welcome you to the center when you come. So thank you again, Professor Loh, and from behalf of the center and as well as the students here, hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen, and thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.